My Lords, I start by drawing attention to my entries in the Register of Interests, and I thank all those members of your Lordship's House who have agreed to speak today. I'm really very grateful to everybody. Now, with COP29 well underway in Baku, it's a timely moment to have this debate, even if perhaps that conference is attracting rather less interest than in previous years. That's certainly not, I think, because of lack of interest in the climate and energy issue. President Trump's election is likely to open up debate once again at a global level. In the EU, we see increasing levels of doubt about the policy consequences of the climate commitments already made. And here in the UK, of course, we have the new government's plan to decarbonise the energy grid by 2030, with a report last week from NESO, the newly formed National Energy System Operator, which constitutes the first detailed commentary on that plan. Now, of course, central to that plan is delivery of large-scale renewable capacity for our energy grid, both wind, onshore and offshore, and solar, together with a revamp of the transmission system to handle that. The NESO report provides us with costings for all of this and much else beside. Now, like most other official and quasi-official studies on the costs of net zero, they use figures already produced by the government for this purpose. And that's why it's such a matter of regret that there appears to be, shall we say, a large measure of disagreement about many of those underlying figures. We would have a much higher quality debate, I think, about the costs of net zero overall if there were at least consensus on the underlying figures. And there is not, and that's why I felt it right to try and secure today's debate on this matter. I don't expect we'll find consensus today either, I fear, but perhaps we can hope to shed some light on why the differences exist. The difficulty arises, I think, for two broad reasons. First of all, there are starkly different views of the levelized costs of renewables, particularly onshore and offshore wind, and these are relevant to the closely connected question of subsidies to this sector, of course. Second, it's an inevitable consequence of the intermittent nature of renewables that this imposes costs elsewhere on the energy system. Backup, interconnectors, other non-renewable generation, measures to ensure grid stability, together with the costs of rebuilding and refiguring the transmission system, and all this seemingly on a highly ambitious scale. And I want to look at these areas in turn. First of all, the levelized costs of renewables. That is, the cost of building and operating wind and solar discounted over time. The latest official figures on this were published in 2023 by the Department of Energy and Net Zero, and the NESO report, as I said, is based on these. Now, those figures claim that offshore wind can generate power at £44 per megawatt hour in current prices. Yet AR6, the recent round of capacity auctions, awarded contracts for offshore wind at £82 per megawatt hour in current prices. It's difficult to understand why there should be such a significant difference between these figures if the £44 figure is in any way correct. And one becomes even more baffled if you look at the actual accounts of recently commissioned offshore wind farms, which suggest a production cost of around £100 a megawatt hour. Or indeed, if you look at the recent payments published yesterday to offshore wind farms under contracts for difference, which suggest a production cost of around £150 per megawatt hour. There are similar huge gaps in other areas of the costings. DESNEs assume a capital cost for offshore wind of £1.5 million per megawatt of capacity. Yet if you look at the accounts of wind companies, once again, the figure appears to be about £3 million per megawatt. That's twice as much. And indeed, at the end of 2023, the developers of Moray West wind farm were still installing the foundations of the wind farm, yet had already, at that point, spent the equivalent of £1.6 million per megawatt hour. Now, it bears noting that if the seemingly correct higher offshore wind capital spending figure were used, the NESO estimate for capex in every year from now to 2030 would go up by about £15 billion every year, taking the total capex from 31 to 34 billion to 45 to 50 billion annually. To take just one other further difference, the DESNES figures assume a 61% capacity factor for offshore wind. That is, they assume that over a year they generate about 3/5 of their notional installed capacity. But once again, recent wind farms are opening at a capacity of 45% when new, and that figure is actually falling over time. The real capacity factor over the whole of the life of a wind farm may well be under 40%. If that's correct, that means we'll need to build 50% more offshore wind farms to get to the actual power that DESNZ estimate, and of course costs will go up by the same amount. I note, my lords, that Professor Gordon Hughes from Edinburgh University and Andrew Montfort, director of the organisation Net Zero Watch, wrote to the Permanent Secretary at DESNZ on 16 September asking for further detail on some of these discrepancies, and they haven't yet received a reply. Now, those figures are just the actual costs of operating offshore wind. The gap between assumptions, auctions, actual real-world costs explains why there's been such a need for subsidies ever since the shift to renewables began in the mid-2000s. The OBR says that, I quote, environmental levies, a catch-all category which covers the renewables obligation, the contracts for difference, the feed-in tariffs, currently stand at about £12 billion a year. That is over £400 for every UK household. Yeah, one has to ask again, if the real cost of offshore wind really is £44 a megawatt hour, well below current market prices, well below the prices agreed in auction rounds, then why do we need these subsidies at all? Now, to my second category, the costs elsewhere in the energy system. I think everybody agrees there are some costs. The question is how high and what the consequentials are. Now, the costs are principally those of intermittency, and there are two kinds of intermittency. The one, the better-known one, is the fact that little power is generated by renewables when the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine, periods like the one we saw in this country for most of last week. This requires backup. It's currently mainly gas, and there is obviously a capital cost in maintaining a dual system of any kind. Moreover, the fact that the gas-fired stations can't be used at close to full capacity but must be turned on and off at short notice brings a cost in reduced efficiency and revenue. The cost of paying operators not to shut their power down as a result of this lack of efficiency, the so-called capacity market, is currently £1 billion a year. The OBR says this will rise to £4 billion in 3 years' time. Now, the other kind of intermittency, which is less well known, is the reverse. What happens when the wind blows and the sun shines, when we don't need the power that's generated? Now, this, under our current arrangements anyway, involves us paying the renewable producers not to produce and to turn their kit off to avoid grid instability. This costs us £2.5 billion a year, and again, this is expected to rise to £3.5 billion in 3 years' time. It bears noting, my lords, that the more renewables we produce and build, the bigger these figures are going to get. The more we rely on renewables, the bigger the problem when we have the wrong kind of weather, and the bigger the concomitant costs are going to be. That's why it is, I think, a simple fallacy, though seemingly a widely believed one, that building more renewables reduces costs and brings more security. It's surely clear that the reverse must be true. Finally, my lords, there are the wider knock-on costs, most notably in the plans for what NESO has called demand management. That is, rationing of energy if the grid cannot supply enough energy to meet the demand. This will come either by compulsion, for example in plans to reduce supply to industry in such circumstances, or by price rationing to consumers, or both. The NESO plan shows that demand management is slated to cover by 2030 5 times as much potential demand as now. That is about 10 gigawatts. Now, you may say, and people do say, that there have always been differential energy tariffs. And indeed, some of us are old enough to remember things like Economy 7 from the 1980s. But that was differential pricing to stimulate demand in the night time when supply was high but demand was low. This is the reverse. This is a plan for us to put up with differential pricing to reduce demand when it is demand that's high and it is supply that is low. That is quite different. It necessarily imposes an economic cost on industry and the consumer, for they cannot use energy when they want to use it, and may have no warning of the fact either. It's hard to quantify that cost, but it's clearly potentially significant. It should be factored in to the cost of running an intermittent renewable system, but it is not. The only attempt I'm aware of by government to quantify some of these wider costs, though not all of them, for some are still excluded, was made by the then BEIS in 2020 in its document that was entitled Energy Generation Costs 2020. This showed, even on the imperfect measures they were using, that both offshore and onshore wind were on average likely to be more expensive than modern gas power stations, even allowing for some of the implausible assumptions that I've been discussing earlier. My Lords, let's try and bring all this together. We have a significant disagreement, call it what you will, in assessments of the levelized costs of renewables. And in the case of offshore wind, it's a discrepancy amounting to potentially up to £100 a megawatt hour. The high levels of subsidy that we're paying in various forms suggest that the production costs are in fact quite a lot higher than is acknowledged. And there are wider costs to the grid, the 3, 4, 5 billion in the current year, growing in the future, and to the economy, hard to quantify, but definitely present in the various kinds of inefficiencies created by an inefficiently working electricity supply system. So in short, one side of this argument sees low levelized costs and believes they'll fall further. The other, with which I associate myself obviously, sees costs which are not falling and require high and growing levels of subsidy and complexity to make the whole system work properly. Now, my Lords, it seems to me the situation is deeply unsatisfactory. The government is about to embark on a dash to decarbonise the electricity grid on the basis of an assessment which is based on certainly disputable direct costings, certainly costings which will be heavily contested, and which simply fails to take into account some of these wider costs and consequentials. And I really think this isn't good enough, and the country's owed better. I recognise, of course, that when the Noble Lord, the Minister, responds, he may not have the information he needs to reply fully on some of these detailed points, and I hope he might do in writing and perhaps at the same time encourage his Permanent Secretary to reply to Professor Hughes' letter that I mentioned earlier. I say all this not to make a political point. We really do need to understand better the real cost of renewables to the consumer, the government and to the economy. If it turns out that I'm wrong and the costs really are low and falling, then that is going to be excellent news for us all. I'm doubtful about renewables not on some ideological grounds, but because they seem to me extremely expensive in their own right and to come with many additional costs and security risks too. And I haven't yet seen the evidence that will persuade me otherwise. So, my Lords, I'll finish on this point. And with this in mind, and I'm not sure the Minister will leap with alacrity on what I'm about to say, but I hope he might respond anyway. I do think the government should consider establishing some form of expert committee on this subject, made up of officials and experts from the department, from bodies like NISO and the Climate Change Committee, with a red team of outside experts to provide challenge, to look at a totally transparent basis of the evidence, the costings, to see how close they could actually get to a common view. And this would seem to me the best way of getting at the reality and at an assessment which might command a bit more consensus than the current situation does. Whatever this country's future energy policy may be, we surely all want it to be established on the best possible analysis and the best possible knowledge. So I look forward to our debate today and to the Noble Lord the Minister's response.